Imagine this. You're attending a fancy dinner party somewhere in Europe during the 1600s. The host proudly reveals the main course. But instead of a roast pig or a fancy bird like a peacock, it's crushed up human remains and people actually start eating it. That's not something your history teacher probably ever mentioned? Yep, you heard that correctly. For hundreds of years, Europeans didn't just collect mummies, they literally ate them. Real ancient Egyptian mummies, ground into powder, used as medicine, mixed into bread, and even served at high-class dinners. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a second. Why on earth would anyone do that? Was it part of some creepy ritual? A strange way to show off? Or did they really believe that eating dried-up ancient bodies would somehow help them? Well, keep watching, because this story only gets more bizarre. We're about to explore one of the weirdest health fads in history, a trend that turned sacred. Egyptian remains into a hot-selling item across Europe. And you won't believe the kind of exclusive parties where mummy meat became the main course. Honestly, what these so-called sophisticated Europeans did with Egyptian mummies is going to blow your mind. Let's go back to the 1500s. Europe was deep into what we now call the Renaissance. Let's just say people were doing some wild stuff. Explorers were returning from far-off places with tales that sounded like they came from a fantasy novel. But nothing caught the imagination of Europeans more than ancient Egypt. Think of it like the ultimate way to impress people back then. If you were someone important or wanted to look important, you had to own something Egyptian. That meant statues, rare artifacts, and most of all, mummies. These weren't just seen as dried-up bodies. They were luxury items, status symbols, and believe it or not, people actually thought they had healing powers. The trade routes connecting Egypt to Europe didn't just carry spices or fancy cloth anymore. Now they were transporting entire preserved human bodies across the sea. Mummies became so popular that merchants actually showed them off in store windows like expensive merchandise. Picture yourself walking through the streets of London or Paris and seeing a real Egyptian mummy, sitting next to fine fabric and exotic perfumes. And this obsession wasn't just a short-lived trend either. Rich European families would throw huge parties just to unwrap a mummy in front of their guests. Imagine something like today's unboxing videos, but much more disturbing. Guests would gather around, drink wine, and watch as the ancient wrappings were slowly removed to reveal the person inside. Again, you're definitely not going to find this in your school textbook. But here's where things get even weirder. These mummies weren't just dusty display pieces in someone's home. Pharmacies actually stocked pieces of mummies right alongside everyday herbs and medicines. Painters even used a color called mummy brown, which was made using actual mummy remains. Even Shakespeare talked about using mummy as medicine in his plays. This wasn't some shady backroom trade. It was completely normal in European culture at the time. Now we get to the truly shocking part. Mummies stopped being just strange souvenirs or rare collectibles. Europeans started turning them into ingredients for homemade medicine. These sacred ancient remains became something you'd expect to see in a medieval first aid kit. And believe me, what came next was even more unbelievable. So how did anyone even come up with the idea that crushed up mummies could be used as medicine? It all started with a giant misunderstanding about something called bitumen. That's a sticky, black tar-like material found in nature. Old Arabic medical books praised bitumen for its healing powers, and they called it mummia. Here's where the confusion started. European scholars noticed that real Egyptian mummies looked black and shiny, and they assumed they were preserved using this same magical bitumen. But it didn't stop there. European doctors came up with an absolutely wild theory called sympathetic medicine. According to this theory, the preserved flesh of a dead person could pass on its ability to resist decay to a living person's body. So in their minds, eating parts of a mummy was like swallowing some kind of magical, life-extending supplement. These mummies had lasted thousands of years, so obviously, they must have known the secret to preserving human flesh at least. That's what people believed back then. We're not talking about some shady backstreet medicine here. The most respected doctors in Europe were fully on board with the mummy craze. The royal doctor of Francis I of France used to prescribe powdered mummy as medicine. King Charles II of England had his own personal recipe for something he called the King's Drops. It actually included ground-up human skull and mummy extract. Even the well-known philosopher Francis Bacon praised mummy-based medicine, like it was some miracle cure. But this kind of thing, you never hear about it in your school history books. So, what did people back then think mummies could heal? Pretty much anything. Headaches, bruises, broken bones, nausea, seizures, the plague, internal bleeding, you name it. And they believed mummy powder could fix it. They'd mix this stuff into herbal drinks, make pills from it, dissolve it into liquids, and even use it as ointment for wounds. Some doctors even prescribed something called mummy wine. Yes, real wine with bits of mummy mixed in. This wasn't just some short trend that passed. This practice lasted for centuries. From the 1100s all the way to the 1700s, medical books regularly listed mummy ingredients in their recipes. Mummy medicine was so common that you could walk into nearly any pharmacy in Europe and ask for prepared mummy, just like we ask for aspirin today. But here's the twist. Remember how it all began with confusion about a material called bitumen? Well, ancient Egyptians didn't even use bitumen to preserve bodies. They used things like special salt, called natron, and plant-based resins. So Europeans actually spent hundreds of years eating preserved bodies because they misunderstood a word in Arabic. It's a seriously big translation fail. As the demand for mummy medicine went through the roof, it led to one of the strangest supply chains in history. Egyptian tombs became the new gold rush. Groups of grave robbers would sneak into burial sites and sometimes come out with dozens of mummies in one night. They'd sell these to traders, who'd pack them onto ships heading to Europe, just like shipping cattle. These traders didn't handle the mummies with care either. They often broke the bodies into smaller chunks to squeeze more into their crates. Imagine Egyptian tomb raiding turned into a creepy version of Tetris. Here's where it takes an even darker turn. As more people wanted mummy medicine, the supply couldn't keep up. So sellers got creative. Some started making brand new mummies from recently dead people. They take corpses from hospitals or from execution sites, coat them in spices and bitumen, wrap them up, and they had what looked like genuine Egyptian mummies, ready to sell. The mummy trade had something for every kind of buyer. Wealthy collectors could buy entire mummies to show off at home. Middle-class folks might grab a small piece or a jar of powdered mummy at their neighborhood pharmacy. Some shops even had grinding stations where customers could pick out a mummy, watch it get crushed on the spot, and take it home fresh. Just like today's luxury items, there were premium options too. The best ones were claimed to come from Egyptian royalty, though. That was usually a lie. Mid-range products were labeled as coming from priests or nobles. Budget shoppers could get common mummy powder, which was likely just regular human remains mixed with spices to make it seem exotic. The trade was so huge and so profitable that by the 1600s, Egypt was running low on ancient mummies. We were talking about thousands and thousands of preserved bodies dug up and sent to Europe to be ground down and swallowed. You have to wonder how many valuable archaeological artifacts ended up crushed into dust and hidden in someone's medicine cabinet. And just when you thought this whole story couldn't get any stranger here, come the mummy dinner parties. Yes, seriously. These were real banquets where the main dish was actual mummy meat. Picture this. It's France in the 1680s. You're at a fancy party with rich and powerful guests. The host wants to impress everyone with their wealth and global knowledge, so they serve dishes made from Egyptian mummies. People are eating slices of dried flesh taken from ancient bodies, seasoned like gourmet food. They're sipping wine mixed with mummy powder, eating bread baked with crushed mummy in the dough, and even stirring sugar laced with mummy dust into their drinks. It was like a weird, dark version of the farm tote table, trend only in this case. The farm was a tomb, and the food came from people who had died 1,000 years earlier. But the upper class didn't just stop at eating mummies. They took things to another level. Some of them started throwing what they called mummy painting parties, where artists used a paint color known as mummy brown, made from ground-up mummies, to paint portraits of the party guests. Others took things even further and arranged events called mummy unwrapping ceremonies. They'd invite friends over to watch the wrapping of ancient mummies being peeled off, treating it like a trendy social event. The most unbelievable part? Back then, none of this seemed strange or shocking to them. European elites thought of mummies as exotic goods, not as actual dead people. They'd casually talk about how to prepare mummy flesh, like they were swapping cooking recipes. Some hosts would even show off, bragging about how old their mummy was, claiming it came from a real pharaoh or a high priest from ancient Egypt. Things got so out of hand that by the mid-1700s, some doctors in Europe were recommending specific parts of a mummy's body for different health problems. They believed the skull was best for headaches, the heart was good for heart problems, and the feet helped with foot pain. Wealthy patients could even request these specific pieces, while poorer people had to settle for generic mummy powder. And if you're wondering if anyone back then thought this was strange or wrong, yes, a few people did. One Arab doctor named Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi visited Egypt in the 1100s and was absolutely shocked to learn that Europeans were eating mummies. He wrote that it was a brutal, uncivilized habit that had no place among decent people. Clearly, he was way ahead of his time. So what finally made Europeans stop eating mummies? It wasn't like they suddenly realized it was wrong. It happened slowly, as people began to question whether eating ancient human bodies really made sense for treating illness. The first real crack in the idea of mummy medicine came from an unexpected source: tomb robbers. By the 1700s, many of them started to admit that most of their so-called ancient Egyptian mummies were actually fakes. Some were even made from the bodies of recently dead criminals. Nothing ruins a luxury trend faster than realizing you've been eating someone who just died a few months ago, not an ancient king. Then came the rise of modern science. Doctors started doing something new, actually testing whether treatments worked. It sounds basic now, but back then, this was revolutionary. They started to question old traditions. And surprise, surprise, there wasn't any proof that eating powdered mummy cured anything. In fact, all it did was probably make people sick. But what really ended the trend of eating mummies was a growing respect for Egyptian culture. As historians and researchers began to study hieroglyphs and learn about ancient Egyptian beliefs, they made a shocking realization: these mummies were real people. They had names, families, and deeply held spiritual beliefs about the afterlife. Attitudes across Europe started to change quickly. Same upper-class people who once threw mummy dinner parties now began to see the practice as horrifying. Museums started collecting mummies to study and preserve them, not to grind them into medicine. By the late 1800s, eating mummies went from being high society behavior to something people were embarrassed to admit ever doing. The heartbreaking part is that by the time Europe realized how wrong all of this was, it was already too late. So many mummies had been destroyed. A huge part of human history was lost, literally turned into powder, and swallowed, all because of a long-running medical trend. Some researchers believe that hundreds of thousands of mummies were consumed during that time. This strange part of Europe's past left more than just disturbed archaeologists. It completely changed the way we treat ancient remains. These days, museums follow strict rules when handling human bodies. And yes, don't eat them is definitely one of those rules. This whole mummy-eating story is a great example of what happens when we treat ancient cultures as weird novelties instead of respecting them as real civilizations. It also shows how common knowledge can be totally wrong. For hundreds of years, even the smartest doctors believed that mummy medicine worked. So, next time someone tells you everybody knows something, remember that there was once a time when everybody knew that eating mummies was healthy. It's easy to look back now and think, wow, those people were out of their minds. But they weren't evil. They were just people trying to solve health problems with the knowledge they had back then. Sure, their beliefs were completely wrong, but they truly thought mummy medicine could heal them. Sometimes they even risked their lives on it. The real lesson here isn't just don't eat mummies. It's about how even very smart people can end up believing strange things when those ideas are supported by tradition and authority. So the next time you're feeling sick and thinking about trying that trendy new supplement you saw on social media, take a moment to remember those Europeans and their powdered mummy cure. At least your health remedy isn't made from ancient human remains.